You might have thought that the Rothschilds actually needed war. After all, some of Nathan's biggest deals had been produced by war. And if it hadn't been for war, 19th century states wouldn't have needed to issue any bonds for the Rothschilds to buy and sell. But the trouble with war, and even more so with revolution, was that it increased the risk that a debtor state might fail to meet its commitments, and that hit the price of existing bonds. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschilds were no longer mere traders. They were fund managers, carefully tending to a vast portfolio of their own government bonds. Now, they stood to lose much more than to gain from conflict.
The Rothschilds had helped decide the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars by putting their financial weight behind Britain. Now they would help decide the outcome of the American Civil War by choosing to sit on the sidelines. Once again, it was the masters of the bond market who would be the arbiters of war. "50 years after the Battle of Waterloo, and on the other side of the world, another great war would be decided by the power of the bond market. But this time, it would be the vanquished who made the big bet and lost. The traditional view is that the key turning point in the American Civil War came in June 1863, 2 years into the conflict. That was the month when Union forces captured Jackson, the Mississippi state capital, and forced a Confederate army to retreat westward to Vicksburg, their backs to the Mississippi River. Surrounded with Union gunboats bombarding their positions from behind, the Southerners held out for a month before finally laying down their arms. After Vicksburg, the Mississippi was firmly in the hands of the North. The South was literally split in two. Yet this military setback wasn't the decisive factor in the South's ultimate defeat. The real turning point came earlier, and it was financial. 200 miles downstream from Vicksburg, where the Mississippi joins the Gulf of Mexico, lies the port of New Orleans.
This is Fort Pike, built after 1812 to protect New Orleans from a future British attack. But 50 years later, it wasn't able to protect the South from a northern attack when Captain David Farragut seized New Orleans on April the 28th, 1862. It was a crucial moment in the Civil War because New Orleans was the principal outlet for the South's most important export.
Cotton. Without control over the cotton trade, the South's cause was doomed. Because cotton had become the essential ingredient in an ambitious scheme to bring the bond market into the war. Like the Italian city-states 500 years before, the Confederate Treasury had initially raised money for the war by selling bonds to its own citizens. But there was a finite amount of capital available in the South. To survive, the Confederacy looked to Europe in the hope that the world's greatest financial dynasty might help them beat the North, as they had helped Wellington beat Napoleon. Initially, the Confederacy had grounds for optimism. In New York, the Rothschilds' agent was sympathetic, having opposed the North's leader, Abraham Lincoln, in the presidential election of 1860. But still the Rothschilds hesitated. Lending to the British government to help defeat Napoleon had been one thing, but buying bonds from a bunch of breakaway southern slave states seemed a risk too far. The Rothschilds decided to stay out. Yet despite this setback, the Confederate government had an ingenious trick up their sleeves. The trick, like the sleeves themselves, was made of cotton. The South's idea was to use cotton as collateral to back its bonds. Investors would be comforted to know that even if the interest payments dried up, they could still demand their cotton instead. The South's agents went to work selling the bonds in the financial centres of Europe.
When the Confederacy tried to market conventional bonds in European financial centres like Amsterdam's, investors wouldn't touch them with a barge pole. But when an obscure French firm named Emile Erlanger and Company offered cotton-backed bonds, it was a completely different story. The key to the success of the Erlanger bonds was that they converted into cotton at the pre-war price of 6p a pound.
These cotton bonds formed the basis of the South's new financial strategy. If they could restrict the supply of cotton, its value and the value of the bonds would increase. At the same time, the Confederates set out to use cotton to blackmail the most powerful country in the world, Britain.
Growth of the United States of America provided Liverpool with growing volumes of trade, and new docks opened on the Mersey in quick succession during the 1800s.
In 1860, the Port of Liverpool was the principal gateway for imports of cotton to the British textile industry, then the mainstay of the Victorian industrial economy. More than 80% of the cotton came from the southern United States. Now, that gave the Confederate leadership hope that they had the leverage to bring in Britain on their side in the Civil War. To ratchet up the pressure, they decided to impose an embargo on all shipments of cotton to Liverpool.
For a while, the South's strategy worked brilliantly. Cotton prices soared. So did the value of the Confederates' cotton-backed bonds. And the cotton embargo devastated the British economy. Mills were forced to lay off workers. Eventually, in late 1862, production all but ceased.
This cotton mill in Style, south of Manchester, employed around 400 workers, but that was just a fraction of the 500,000 people employed by King Cotton across Lancashire. Obviously, with no cotton, there was nothing for people to do. By the end of 1862, half the entire workforce of Lancashire had been laid off. A quarter of the population was on poor relief. They called it the cotton famine, but this really was a man-made famine.
Britain was in the doldrums, and the South's cotton bonds were riding high. Yet the South's ability to manipulate the bond market depended on one overriding condition: that investors could be sure of taking physical possession of the cotton which underpinned the bonds if the South failed to make its interest payments. And that's why the fall of New Orleans on April the 28th, 1862, was the real turning point in the American Civil War. Now that the South's main port was in Union hands, any investor who wanted to lay his hands on Southern cotton had to run the Union's formidable naval blockade. The Confederates had overplayed their hand. They had turned off the cotton tap, but then lost the ability to turn it back on. By 1863, the mills of Lancashire had found new sources of cotton in China, Egypt, and India, and investors were rapidly losing faith in the South's cotton-backed bonds. The consequences for the Confederate economy were disastrous.
With its domestic bond market exhausted and only 2 paltry foreign loans, the Confederacy really had no alternative but to print paper dollars, like these ones here in the Louisiana State Museum, to pay for the war. In all, $1.7 billion worth. Now, it's true that the North also printed paper money, but by the end of the war, its greenbacks was still worth around 50 pre-war cents, whereas a Southern greyback was down to just 1 cent. What's more, with more and more of this cash chasing fewer and fewer goods, inflation in the South simply exploded. By January 1865, the price of some goods was up by a factor of 90.
The South had bet everything on manipulating the bond market and had lost. It would not be the last time in history that an attempt to do so would end in ruinous inflation. Today, the global market for bonds is still bigger than all the world's stock markets put together. It's still a market that can make or break governments. Does it surprise you that its key player began his money-making career in the casinos of Las Vegas?
I was a blackjack player, one of the first professional blackjack players, not to brag, but in the late 60s, I went to Vegas and applied a card counting system to try and beat Vegas.
Now this master of understatement is the king of the bond market, controller of the biggest bond fund in the world. So what has this got to do with you and me? Well, when Gross buys or sells bonds, it doesn't just affect financial markets and government policy. It affects the value of our pension funds and the interest rates we pay on our mortgages. There's only one thing that Mr. Bond is afraid of, and it's not Goldfinger. Rather, it's inflation. The lethal danger that inflation poses is that it undermines the value